Diabetes Connections is brought to you by the only ultra-rapid-acting inhaled insulin by Dexcom, keeping you in control with an integrated system for diabetes management, and by Omnipod. Simplify life with Omnipod 5.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacy Sims.
This week, Dr. Bryce Nelson is one of the first in the country to use the new Tzield to delay the onset of type 1. He's been involved with TrialNet, identifying those who have the genetic markers for T1D, and he says that research was exciting but frustrating.
We may identify them as have stage 2, but there wasn't much that we could offer other than just watch them. And then eventually they go on to develop stage 3 and need insulin treatment. But at this point, now we have something that could potentially slow that, and will slowing it increase the likelihood of that there may be something else that we can do in a couple years.
Dr. Nelson takes us through the process of using Tzield, which was researched under the name teplizumab, from identifying the patient, explaining those stages, to treatment, to what happens next. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome back to another week of the show. I am always so glad to have you here. You know, we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacy Sims, and my son was diagnosed with type 1 right before he turned 2. He is now 18. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting, and that is how you get the podcast. We've been doing it since 2015. And I feel like since 2015, we have been talking about all the things that have led to this research now being available. We've been talking about TrialNet and the research that has led to this, and teplizumab. If this is the first time you're hearing about all this, it's going to make sense. I think this is a really good episode with a really good doctor who explains things very well. But if you're not that familiar or want to look back at some of the history of this or how did we get here, I've done a ton of episodes on TrialNet and all this information. At diabetes-connections.com, we have a really robust search engine. On the upper right-hand side of the page, you can search any keyword, and any episode featuring that will just pop up. With more than 550 episodes now, I know it can be a little confusing as to where to go, but that keyword search, I have been told, is really easy to use, and I'd urge you to check it out. A few weeks ago, we talked to Amanda Troutman, whose son William was the first in my area. I live in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, to be treated with Tzield, and he was one of the first in the country as well, in the hopes of delaying a type 1 diagnosis. During that episode, I promised to follow up with the doctor to get a more medical perspective, and that's what this week's show is all about. Dr. Bryce Nelson is the chief of endocrinology at Children's Hospital of Richmond. I met him years ago when he worked in South Carolina. You don't have to have heard the previous episode to get what we're talking about here, but that show has a great perspective of what it is like to have a family member, Amanda's son, go through this process. Dr. Nelson does have a close family connection. His uncle lived with type 1 and inspired him to become an endocrinologist. We talked about that in more detail in an episode I did with him back in 2019, and I will link that up. But as you can imagine, his uncle being diagnosed at age 12 in the 1960s was a very different experience than certainly what my son or anybody diagnosed today goes through now. And Dr. Nelson's uncle died too young. I mention that because we talk about it in the last part of the interview. It is emotional, and I decided to leave it all in. This is one good guy you're about to hear from. Let me just say for a moment, little soapbox moment, endocrinologists, most of them, especially pediatric endocrinologists, they're special people, right? This is not the most highly paid specialty if you do any research into it, but the research does show that they get a lot of job satisfaction. And the really good ones, and man, we're lucky to have one, they care about these kids, and they do camps, and they do programs, and they talk to parents at all hours of the day and night. And that's not my perspective, right? I'm a parent of a child with type 1, but I can only imagine what it means for them to finally have some more tools, not perfect, right? Not permanent, but some more tools to help the families that they have to say, sorry, your child has type 1 diabetes. And we do talk about that as well. So let's get to it. You will hear from Dr. Nelson in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. And you know I'm a big fan of choice when it comes to diabetes technology. I get so excited when there's something new because if you live with diabetes, you deserve to find the best fit for you. That's just one reason I'm working with Omnipod to help spread the word about what makes it so easy to test their system out. If you want to try an insulin pump or see what life without tubes is all about, you can try Omnipod 5 with no commitment or obligation. You can try Omnipod even if your current tubed pump is in warranty. Really? You heard that right. And if it's not right for you, no problem. Omnipod does not tie you down with a contract or a tube. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. Terms and conditions apply. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, also visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for joining me. I got a lot of questions when we talked to this family, so I am thrilled to have you as the physician here on the show. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Oh, thank you, Stacey. This is quite an honor to be back with you again. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Let's just jump right in. How early did you become an office or a hospital system where Tzield was even an option? Because I got to tell you, this seemed really fast from where I sit.
I was fortunate when I was in Greenville, South Carolina, that I was part of TrialNet, and I worked with some wonderful mentors, Dr. Bill Russell at Vanderbilt, Dr. Des Schatz at the University of Florida, and Mike Howler. And because we were a TrialNet affiliate in Greenville, we were asked to follow up some of the patients that were in the TrialNet teplizumab trial. So I did have some experience with this when I was in Greenville. And, I obviously had been paying attention and was aware of the studies and that Prevention Bio was seeking FDA approval for that. And so I started really pretty early on, Stacey. So to say that it was fast, it really wasn't. I started probably about a year ago working with my health system to say, I want to make this a priority, that I think that our division needs to have the things in place so that we can provide this care, because this is going to be really a new and exciting way that we can help provide care for families who are experiencing type 1 diabetes and helping to just, how do I handle the risk factors and what do I do if I do have a child who is at risk and starting to have some problems with abnormal blood sugar. So like I said, it really started about a year ago that I did this. And so I was pretty ready. Once we had the FDA notification, I then went into implementation mode. I had a lot of the pieces together, just had to start saying, okay, now we're here, let's go.
Right. So even you saying it's a year, it's really more than that, as you say, with your experience with TrialNet.
Right.
Going back, I've got to imagine at least 5 to 7 years. I'm trying to think when we first started talking about TrialNet. I think right at the beginning of my show, which started in 2015.
That study was, around 2010 to about 2017, they were recruiting patients for that study. And so it was a while to get that study completed. Then when it was published in 2019, that's when a lot of the excitement started to really kind of build around this as a possibility for using and thinking about managing type 1 diabetes in a different way. But it's not just about managing, Stacey. I mean, one of the things that we really have to do is change providers' perceptions about when does type 1 diabetes start, and are there ways that we can try to intervene earlier to try to prevent that progression to needing insulin as a final treatment.
I'm going to preface these next couple of questions by saying, I know you won't share more about the Troutman family than you are allowed. Obviously, there are some privacy concerns here, but they have publicly shared quite a bit. And Amanda came on the show and shared quite a bit. Right. So as we talk, I understand if you need to, if you can answer some questions, that's absolutely fine. From your perspective as a pediatric endocrinologist, you have this tool now. You're looking for a family, or did they just come streaming in? How did you get to the Troutman family?
Yeah, so I think in these initial phases, I really looked more towards taking advantage of the fact that we were a TrialNet affiliate, and we're in Greenville. We are here in Richmond, Virginia, because that's where we're seeing a lot, or we're seeing the people with quote unquote stage 2 type 1 diabetes, which for your listeners, just to recap, that's where patients who have relatives with type 1 diabetes, these individuals have evidence of diabetes autoimmunity. So they have blood tests or markers, antibodies that are associated with type 1 diabetes, and they have at least 2. And then stage 2 is where they're starting to develop some abnormal blood sugars, but not in the quote unquote diabetes range at this point. So they have impaired glucose tolerance or impaired fasting glucose. We have been following those families in TrialNet. And so once this was available, and it was a combination really, it was reaching out, but as you know, a lot of these families are very highly engaged, and they're reaching out to us when they know that this was approved, just to see if this is something that is a potential medication that can be used.
When you mentioned the stages, I stumbled all over myself recording the episode with the Troutman family, trying to say stage 2 of type 1 diabetes.
I understand.
So it's stage 1 is normal, stage 2 is abnormal blood sugar, as you said, and is stage 3 the clinical diagnosis?
That is what we recognize as clinical diagnosis, meaning that those individuals they have blood sugars in diabetes range, so randoms above 200, fasting above 126, and require insulin for treatment. That's what we classically know as the type 1 diabetes. What we have learned through TrialNet and through the natural history study is that type 1 diabetes actually develops years before that. This is something that has been hypothesized for many, many years, that there are triggers that lead the immune system to start to attack the pancreas or the islet cells that make insulin. And so there is a time where people are just having that autoimmune response, but have normal blood sugars. What we have learned through the natural history study with TrialNet is that stage 1 is when people have 2 or more antibodies. So we know through that study that if people have 2 or more antibodies, it is more likely that not a matter of if they will go on to develop stage 3 type 1 diabetes, but a matter of when. So it is a progression. And the stage 1 is where they have those antibodies, but their blood sugars are normal. And then stage 2 is where they have the antibodies and the blood sugars are starting to show evidence of abnormality, but not in full-blown diabetes range. And then stage 3 finally is what we all know of and treat as type 1 diabetes.
So, as you said, being a TrialNet affiliate and the families kind of knowing and a lot of families being very well educated about this stuff, they started calling you. What's that like to have, I assume, more than one family calling you saying, can we get this? How do we get this, kind of knocking at your door?
Well, for me, it's exciting. I think that this is an exciting time for our field, and I enjoy that engagement with our families to where we can work together on this. So I'm very excited about that. It might be that, I get calls that they may not qualify for teplizumab, but that's still an opportunity to ask the question, well, what can I do to help? And whether that be to try to help get referrals and locally to help seek other care. But I think it's exciting. And we have seen models of this in type 1 diabetes before, right, Stacey? I mean, we think about Night Scout, we think about #We'reNotWaiting. Our field has benefited from the work where patients and providers and researchers are all working together.
Wow, that's a great perspective. So the Troutman family calls you up and says, we've done TrialNet. We have a kid who looks like he qualifies. What happens next? Right back to Dr. Nelson answering my question. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Afrezza. And when it comes right down to it, there hasn't been a lot of innovation for insulin. There are different brands, but really nothing unique when it comes to insulin delivery, except for Afrezza. Afrezza is unique because it is the only ultra-rapid-acting inhaled insulin available. It starts working quickly without the need for injections at mealtime. Once you breathe Afrezza into your lungs using the inhaler, insulin appears in your bloodstream in less than 1 minute, and it may start reducing blood sugar in about 12 minutes. Find out more, see if Afrezza is right for you. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Afrezza logo. Afrezza can cause serious side effects, including sudden lung problems and low potassium, and it's not for patients with chronic lung disease such as asthma or COPD, or for patients allergic to insulin. Tell your doctor if you've ever smoked, have ever had kidney or liver problems, a history of lung cancer, or if you are pregnant or breastfeeding. Most common side effects are low blood sugar, cough, and sore throat. Severe low blood sugar can be fatal. Do not replace long-acting insulin with Afrezza. Afrezza is not for use to treat diabetic ketoacidosis. Please see full prescribing information, including boxed warning, medication guide, and instructions for use on Afrezza.com/safety. Now back to Dr. Nelson, answering my question about the process.
So the next step is we need to make sure that those patients meet the established criteria that's been established with the FDA about what's needed to be diagnosed in order to be eligible for teplizumab. And so that's evidence of 2 or more diabetes-related antibodies, a abnormal glucose tolerance, but not full-blown type 1 diabetes. They don't have evidence of type 2 diabetes. Really, for me, it's so I establish and have a first clinical visit with them so I can establish the criteria and then discuss the risks and benefits. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, this is an expensive medication, and one that can have side effects. And so we want to make sure that first visit is a good conversation with the families about those things. And so once the decision is made to proceed with teplizumab, then it's a matter of submitting to the insurance and seeking approval and going through any processes that need to happen if it's not approved in terms of getting prior authorization or submitting denials. And then once that gets approved, then it's a matter of delivering the medication.
We will come back to the cost.
Sure.
I definitely want to talk about that and what you needed to do to work with insurance. But let's talk about the medication. You know, how does this all work? This is not a pill. This is not a one-time shot. You have to have an infusion, right?
Right. So this medication is a once daily infusion for 14 days. That right now, that's a lifetime treatment. There is certainly research going on and looking at future ways. And, you know, the way I think about that, Stacey, is that, you know, the initial insulin pump didn't look like it did today, right? It was something that you wore on your back as a gigantic backpack. And so things have to innovate. But the way that this medication works, what it does is it attacks a part of the immune system that participates in the ongoing destruction of the beta cells, and it turns it down. It arrests those cells from working. That is the thought of why it can slow the progression of stage 2 type 1 diabetes to stage 3 type 1 diabetes.
What does that translate as for a kid like William?
The median time in the studies is that there was a 2-year delay in the progression to stage 3 median. So there were some that went longer. There were some that went shorter than that compared to those who did not receive that treatment. And so the progression to stage 3 was faster in those who did not receive teplizumab. And that's something we've seen that is sustained, that over time that teplizumab does have some sustained benefit. But that's still really short-lived. I mean, we haven't had a lot of time to study really how long for sure it works in folks. But right now, the label it's about 2 years is what we're seeing. And that opens up a lot of questions, you know, especially when you're thinking about costs and long-term costs and healthcare costs. And, you know, I know and people who may be critical of using this medication at this point, you know, is the current price worth the benefit that we get in terms of slowing this progression for 2 years? You know, that's a debate that's ongoing, and I think is one that we need to have, obviously. What my experience when you talk to a lot of families, and I've talked to a lot of families about this going through TrialNet, because remember, in TrialNet, we may identify them as have stage 2, but there wasn't much that we could offer other than just watch them. And then eventually they go on to develop stage 3 and need insulin treatment. But at this point, now we have something that could potentially slow that. And will slowing it increase the likelihood of that there may be something else that we can do in a couple years? You know, will things innovate to a way that we can continue to do things? I don't know the answer to that question. You know, that leaves areas for criticism about using this, is we don't know the answers to those questions just yet. But if we don't do it, then we never will.
What is it like to have the treatment? I mean, I know you haven't had it, but, you know, I have a picture of William going through, smiling. He's holding up his fingers to show 7. You know, he's 7 days in. It was of the 14-day treatment, but he's smiling. He seems fine. Is it hard on the patient to get the treatment physically?
We learned a lot through the studies about how to try to help minimize some of the side effects. And that is something that we use as a part of the current treatment. Because this is a quote-unquote immunomodulating therapy, it can have some side effects. So you can potentially see fever. It is intended to lower certain blood cell counts. So we're lowering something called T cells. And so we see that it lowers those blood cells. And so that's how you know it's having its effect. And there is a concern that whenever you give any medication like this, there is something called cytokine releasing syndrome, which is a big fancy word for it. It can make kids feel pretty sick, fever, low blood pressure. It could cause problems with the liver. That's why we do pre-medications with certain things so that we can try to prevent those symptoms. And it's actually pretty effective at doing that. It doesn't, in the studies, it wasn't 100%, but there's very relatively low risk for cytokine release syndrome. But you have to make sure that we monitor those kids because that can be a potentially serious complication with this. In the study, it's generally well tolerated as long as we're doing some of that pre-medication.
Is there anything else that happens while the kids or the people are having the treatment? I mean, like I said, they were given the option of staying in the hospital to have the treatment or going home. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else to ask while they're there.
We monitor blood tests for patients who are receiving this infusion daily so that we're keeping an eye on their blood count. We're keeping an eye on their blood sugars. We're keeping an eye on their liver function. We're monitoring their blood pressure. We're monitoring, making sure that their quote unquote vital signs are all stable while they're doing this. So they're very closely monitored. At least for the first time that I did it, I wanted the patient to be there with me so that we could do it here. And they were not patients. We don't admit them to the hospital. We have plans that, and what we do is we have an infusion center as an outpatient facility that we have developed where we provide this infusion therapy. The risk of some of the side effects are worst in the first 5 days of the infusion or the sets of infusions. So after that first 5 days, it seems reasonable that we can look at trying to do some home infusions with patients. Now, that caveat, Stacey, is that every patient is individual. And so it's really a one-on-one discussion with the family and the provider about what we think is going to be the safest route for that patient, just depending on their past medical history. We want to make sure we're doing whatever is the safest for the patient. But there are, options to where we even can do a hybrid where we do those first 5 days in person in the infusion center and then do the rest at home.
Is there any aftercare after that 2 weeks of infusions are up?
Yeah, there is. There's not set standards for that yet. And so what I'm doing is really just following kind of the aftercare that was provided during the study. I am checking labs for patients the first week after they finish so I can make sure that things are still looking okay. And that can either be arranged in my clinic or we can arrange for local labs through LabCorp or anything like that. So if I have patients traveling from out of state, we just coordinate care. There's still ways I can see labs when all that happens. And so it makes it a little easier on travel. I do like to see the patients back in person at 4 weeks and then plan to follow them about every 3 to 6 months and either look at 10-day Dexcom tracings beforehand or do a glucose tolerance test just so I can monitor the pancreas's response and how is it handling blood sugars. The study, it was a glucose tolerance test is what we used, but I think that's still being worked out about what's going to be the best long-term follow-up for these patients.
One of the things that Amanda had expressed to me as more of a desire, not something that she thought was imminent or was a sure thing, was that perhaps her son could receive this treatment again in a couple of years, kind of keep going to delay the onset indefinitely. I'm not going to ask you how realistic that is. If you want to weigh in, feel free. Is that any part of treatment? Is that any part of the roadmap right now for Tzield?
Well, I think that it's an open area right now. I think that, when we look at the studies, right now it provides on a median of about 2 years. So that gives us opportunity for sure to say, well, are there ways that we can prolong that even further? And does that involve additional teplizumab infusions? Does that involve using teplizumab with other medications? I think that is all areas that are being focused on pretty rapidly here to try to answer those questions, because we do know from other studies is that the effect on something called C-peptide, so how much our bodies make insulin, is that teplizumab can protect that, but that is over a finite period of time. I don't know if that particular way where we just do another infusion of teplizumab is what the future will hold. What I do have confidence in is that the future will be something that we will continue to innovate and find ways to work with medications with teplizumab or use additional medications or maybe a different medication. I think that that's what's exciting about this to me is that this really opens up a whole different area of study. And it really does, I shouldn't say it's opened it up, that teplizumab for the slowing the progression of type 1 diabetes is something that's been studied for about 20 years. The fact that we've got this to this point, I think is exciting that, looking at how we're going to build on that and innovate on that. And if we look at other things that we've done with regards to insulin pump therapy, with regards to CGM, I mean, just the change in insulin pump and sensors over the last 10 years has just been dramatic about what we can do and how we can work together. You remember, Stacey, when we look at it, we're still not achieving a majority of our patients. We're not helping them get to goal A1Cs, even though we have all that technology. So I think that this gives us opportunity to try to look at it from a new and different way and treat in a different way.
Let's talk cost. I know it's a tough one and it can vary depending on your insurance company, but my understanding is that you actually had to fight for these patients to get this insurance coverage. Can you take us through that process?
That's not an unexpected thing. I was kind of expecting that at the beginning, especially when it's relatively new. Most insurance companies have as a process, if you will allow me to use that generalization, but where they have to assess this. So this was still very new on the market. I was just prepared to try to help do what's called an appeal. So I was expecting to get a denial initially and just working to provide an appropriate appeal for that. And to be honest, that's something standard, as you know, that providers are doing for patients. And we do a lot of that behind the scenes work with appeals and prior authorizations to try to get the therapy that we think is appropriate for our patients and work together with the insurance companies to do that. The initial cost is on average about $192,000, $200,000. I mean, that's there. You hear a lot of different numbers, but it's somewhere around that kind of range. And, we haven't had cost effectiveness studies yet. And there's some strong opinions about whether that's worth the cost to slow this progression from about 2 years. And, as I said before, I think that's a good discussion for us to have. I think if this can help provide, but what comes into play into that is how do you assess quality of life that can help potentially improve? What is the cost that's assigned to that? What's the price that's assigned to that? And we know that a high percentage of children, when they present with type 1 diabetes, present a diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a very costly admission requiring intensive care. And so it can have its own costs. So trying to weigh those costs, it can be a bit of a challenge. But, I think that as we use this more, that those costs may be coming down and we may start seeing some benefit. But we won't do that if we're not using it.
Yeah. A question from a listener. I don't know if you can answer this. Question came up wondering if you know which insurers might cover it. It sounds like everybody's going to deny it at first, but is there any discussion among doctors or clinics about who might cover it, which different insurers?
Yeah, so I don't have any specifics about that. It's going to depend on the insurance. I think that one thing that would be beneficial for patients is to engage their insurer early if they're thinking about this, just to find out, because that also helps the provider know how to proceed with the appeals process. And then one thing I've recommended to patients is, certainly talking with Prevention Bio. They do have a pretty robust patient assistance program that has proven to be pretty helpful for patients. So I always try to get them engaged with the company Prevention Bio, which makes or markets and distributes teplizumab. I think that, to my knowledge, most of the major insurers are looking at this and determining what is going to be their policy in terms of covering that. One thing about this at this point, from my opinion, is that at that stage of type 1 diabetes in stage 2, there is no other treatment. So the option is that either we safely provide teplizumab if it's safe for that patient and it's deemed to be the appropriate course by the provider and the patient and their family, or we make the decision to watch till they develop stage 3.
Gosh. Are there any guidelines from TrialNet as to who better qualifies? I mean, I'm thinking of my son, right? Diagnosed at 23 months. And I've been told since then that, that's a really tough age for these kinds of treatments, just because the younger, the more acutely it comes on, less of a chance of preserving beta cells. I don't know if that translates to something like this, but it seems that's a young age to go through something like a 2-week transfusion process. Are there any guidelines on age or stage? Well, I shouldn't say stage. Are there guidelines on age?
So there are FDA-approved guidelines, and that's teplizumab is only approved for individuals 8 or above. Yeah. Now, will they be looking to see if we can provide that safely to younger ages? I imagine. Now, that's just my opinion talking. I imagine, but we'd have to make sure that it's safe and beneficial in that younger group. But I think that that's something certainly I would let research guide whether we take that off the table or not. We just have to do the study.
Well, sure.
Yeah. And now with the other thing to remember too is that my hope is that the research will develop to a point where we can identify based on markers people who we know may be teplizumab responders and people who may be non-responders, right? So we'll know at the beginning, based on blood markers and this hasn't been developed yet, but just something I think would make sense is that if we can identify those who would be more likely to respond to teplizumab, then that's who we offer the teplizumab to, and for us to help try to better understand the care.
That's a really good point. I mean, I didn't ask about this, but it sounds like there are people who don't respond to this treatment.
Well, they're differing. I mean, we saw that in the study that, and when I say we, I mean, it was really Kevin Harold and his team and TrialNet. You can see that not everybody responded exactly in the same fashion. There was some differences, but on average, basically, it was about a 2-year benefit.
When it's a 2-year benefit as the median, as you said, what happens when it's no longer a benefit? Does type 1 diabetes come on acutely, or is it more of a soft landing? What have you seen, knowing that there are a lot of variables case to case?
Yeah, so, I haven't seen a patient personally that I've gotten to that point yet. But in the trial, in general, is that we tend to see less presentation in diabetic ketoacidosis. So it tends to be more of a quote unquote soft landing. They're being monitored by an endocrinologist and so they're not just moving from stage 2 to stage 3 without any medical observation, which is what is happening right now most of the time, right?
Yeah. That
does tend to give us a little bit more soft landing. And there's been other studies that because of that monitoring from stage 2 to stage 3, that does we tend to see less diabetic ketoacidosis at presentation. There might also be more preservation of C-peptide, and the beta cells are a little bit healthier when you get to stage 3. So does that prolong honeymoon? So it does tend to, I like how you kind of put that in general, kind of more of a softer landing into stage 3. Although I'll say that's hard for me to swallow.
Really?
I'm looking forward to the day when I can tell people, no, your child is not going to get this when we do this. We're not there yet, but I prefer to be the cup half full that we will get there because there's a lot of smart people working on it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's very exciting stuff. It's very exciting stuff. It's just, I don't know. I'm very optimistic as well, but at the same time, we're not there yet. But I like the way you think. I mean, and you have been seeing patients. Let's talk about this for a minute. You have been seeing patients for more than 20 years. I am one patient or one patient's mom who went to the hospital more than 16 years ago, met a great endocrinologist and got started on this lousy road. But you've had to tell people again and again and again, right, over the years that your child has type 1, your life is about to completely change. I'm curious, do you bring this up now, like early in people's experiences with type 1? How do you talk to them about Tzield?
Yeah, so I've had the fortune with TrialNet that I've had these conversations with families before just because we would identify that they had stage 2 diabetes in TrialNet, stage 2 type 1 diabetes. At that point, the conversation was most of the time, unless TrialNet was doing a study that we could try to get them enrolled in, it was, well, now we're going to watch and see. I always try to approach that with empathy and compassion because I know that that's a family on the other side of that receiving that news, and just one making sure they know that there's somebody on the other side here that cares about what's happening with their child and wanting to monitor this for them and remain hopeful that we will get to the day where we can do those things. And it's also why I encourage participation in research. Now, that is a very individual decision. It's voluntary, but I always like to talk to my families about that because we as a community benefit from working together, and we learn more by participating in the research studies and by giving of ourselves and being altruistic in that way. It may not help us in that study or in the particular need, but it may provide the right person, the right information to answer the right question to get us there. Yeah. And then that's been a significant contribution. And so I talk to families about it in that fashion too, is that innovation has to start somewhere. And what we start at now, it may not be where we end up in 20 years. I mean, Stacey, you probably remember that. I mean, that's the way that you and your family are doing things now is much different than how it was done 20 years ago.
Yeah, no doubt.
You know, my uncle who had type 1 diabetes, you know, he had diabetes at the time where you boiled your reagent on the stove to check a blood sugar. And he had it well before we had these fantastic meters that, think about that technology, can give you a blood sugar reading in 5 seconds. I mean, it's just amazing how that's really evolved over time. And now we have devices that people can wear that can give, you know, blood sugars within a few seconds. And it speaks to the cloud, so they can share it with their family or they can share it with their clinic. And I mean, it's just really amazing how that's evolved over that time. And how timely is it that this came about when we're coming into the 100-year anniversary of the discovery of insulin?
You know, you mentioned your uncle who lived with type 1. We had talked a couple of years ago, and you really told a lovely story about how he inspired you and kind of led you to your path. I imagine you think of him quite a lot when you're talking about and thinking about the teplizumab, and you know how amazing. You mentioned he boiled, he was boiling needles. He could only check blood sugar, with urine. What do you think about when you think about him?
Oh, well, sorry, Stacey. Give me just a second.
Sure.
You know, people who know me and know how I practice and know how important this is to me know that my uncle was a big reason for why I do what I do. And, you know, a lot of us in peds endocrinology have that personal connection in some way or another. And mine happened to be with my uncle. And I felt him through this whole process. And I think, you know, that is part of what led me to do what I did a year ago, because I felt that he was with me. And I hope I'm not getting too sappy with this, but I felt that he was with me and cheering me on. And I felt him when we were successful in getting our patient approved. I felt him when we got it started. And, you know, in some ways I feel a little guilty about that's part of what's coming to my mind. But you can't hide from the things that inspire you. So I think that I'm hoping that he's proud of me. And that's why I do what I do.
If you know Dr. Nelson, this last part of the interview will come as no surprise to you. You are a very, very caring person. You are a genuine person. I know you got emotional there. It's hard for me not to become emotional as well. No, it is wonderful. And I hope I didn't get too personal asking you there. No. We should all have a doctor who cares as much. So thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to try to pivot a little as I get my tissues out here. So what is next? I know you have seen one patient. I know there are patients in a few places across the country who are getting this treatment. Do you anticipate having more in the practice?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I've already been talking to a few patients and working on trying to get them in the process for evaluation and deciding if teplizumab is the right thing for them. And also looking at what's the best way for us to provide that, whether it be 14 days in the infusion center, or can we do a hybrid where we just do 5 days in the infusion center and the other 9 days at home. Where a lot of us are having challenges is how do we provide this care over the weekend? Because a lot of places don't have the infrastructure to be able to provide that over the weekend. But I think as this becomes more prominent and more prolific, you know, the health system, we just have to figure that out. We were successful getting that figured out here. So what I tell people is that it's possible. You have to be patient, persistent, and perseverant, and get the triple Ps in, and that usually gets you there. But I think that's going to be the next piece, is making sure that we can get people approved for it, covered for it, and then be able to provide the infusion safely in either all in person or in some kind of hybrid kind of environment where I can at least follow them for the first few days when they're at the greatest risk for potential side effect.
So Amanda told me that William is back at school, back at sports, feeling really good. Did you tell him anything before he left the hospital? Did you guys have any parting words there until he comes for his follow-ups?
Told him I was proud of him, and I wanted to see him back out running and keep me up to date about how things were going and to be positive about the future.
That's great. What a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing all of the information that you have right now and for letting us get a little personal. Dr. Nelson, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Stacey. I am so thankful and honored that I get to share this earth with someone like you who has always been such a wonderful advocate for these families and providing education and ongoing support. And you've written a wonderful book, and it might get used a time or two in my clinic.
I love that.
And, I think that it's helpful for families to know the personal side of it and know that it's not about being perfect. It's about doing the best we can.
I love it. I'm going to leave it there. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Lots more information on Tzield. I will link up the articles that Dr. Nelson is quoted in, all about William, and that episode, as I mentioned, when we talked to William's mom, Amanda. And you can get a really full picture about the process and what it takes. And of course, we'll follow up here and find out how William is doing. I'm so glad that Dr. Nelson was so open and really leaned into talking about his family and his passion there. And I hope he doesn't mind that I left all of that in. I mean, he said I could, so I know he's okay with it. But man, I just appreciate that really genuine side of somebody. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, most pediatric endocrinologists are really great people and really special. But when one of them, and so many of them, have a family connection to diabetes, it really changes the game. And you can hear his passion for his patients and his positivity as well. Dr. Nelson, thanks for coming on. And man, am I excited to check in with you down the road and see how your patients with Tzield are doing. All right, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And it's hard to remember what things were like before we started using Dexcom. I have not forgotten. But what I mean is, it is so different now. Benny was diagnosed at 2. And, as a toddler, we were doing something like 10 finger sticks a day easily. And even when he got older, we still did at least 6 to 8 every day, more when he wasn't feeling well or when something was off. But with each iteration of Dexcom, we have done fewer and fewer sticks. The Dexcom G6 eliminates finger sticks for calibration and diabetes treatment decisions. I think back to Benny's worn out fingertips. And if you had a child, or if you, as an adult, many of you did finger sticks for years and years, you know what your fingers looked like, right? Dexcom is an incredible tool. And when I look at Benny's fingertips now, they are healthy and smooth. I never, ever thought that would happen when he was in preschool. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. A couple of announcements coming up. I've been talking about where I'm going. And by the way, you can check the community page, diabetes-connections.com. We've got a community page, and that lists where I'm going to be speaking. It also lists what talks that I do. It's an easy way to plan. If you would like me to come to your event, you can kind of see what presentations I have that I can bring to you. We can always talk about doing something else if that strikes your fancy as well. And there's also an events page, and that events page is about to get busy because we are this close to announcing the next Mom's Night Out events, I should say. This really has taken a life of its own, and I've been working really hard behind the scenes. Probably shouldn't say anything until I can say something, but it's coming very, very soon. I would hope as this episode goes live within the next week, 2 weeks at the most. If you'd like to stay up to date on the Mom's Night Out announcements, get them emailed right to you, go to that events page, click on the Charlotte Mom's Night Out. We're changing the webpage by the time the episode comes out. It may say something different, but if you click on the Charlotte event, it will take you to the main page for Mom's Night Out, and there's a place to sign up to keep in touch, and I'll send you the alerts first. We're adding cities. We're going places that don't get a lot of diabetes attention. I'm so excited. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.